Here's what actually happened at Davos over the past 48 hours. The headlines are filled with talk of Trump's framework deal on Greenland. Phrases like breakthrough, compromise, and strategic vision are being thrown around, but they're missing the point. Badly. Because the real story, the one that reshaped the entire mood of the World Economic Forum, wasn't about what Trump announced. It was about what he didn't get. And what happened in the room before he ever spoke. 2 speeches. Same stage. Less than 24 hours apart. One redefined the conversation around global power. The other revealed in real time how a superpower can lose control without firing a shot. Donald Trump arrived in Davos with a strategy centered on escalation. He wanted Greenland. He threatened tariffs. He floated military options. He expected compliance. What he got was resistance, coordinated, public, and immediate. But before that retreat unfolded, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney took the same stage and issued the most direct challenge yet to the post-war world order. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. His message was unmistakable. The international system as we knew it is not evolving. It's rupturing. And if middle powers don't adapt fast, they will be left behind or worse, subordinated. Carney's speech wasn't a reaction to the crisis. It was a blueprint for what comes next. One built not on hope, but on preparation. Not on loyalty to superpowers, but on strategic autonomy. And as Trump's plans unraveled less than a day later, the contrast became impossible to ignore. If you want to understand what really happened at Davos, this is where you start. Tuesday, January 20th. Mark Carney stepped onto the Davos stage, and the room changed. There was no shouting. No drama. No names were called. But everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. Carney isn't a politician in the traditional sense. He doesn't need to be. He carries with him a different kind of authority, the quiet kind that comes from experience. Former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, the only person in history to hold both roles. When he speaks, the financial elite don't just listen. They write things down. But what he said that day wasn't a market analysis. It was a geopolitical wake-up call. He stood at the podium and announced what many had suspected but few dared to say. The post-World War II international order, the system of alliances and laws and norms that governed global affairs for nearly 8 decades, was not weakening. It was gone. Not a transition, not an evolution, a rupture. That was the word that echoed through the hall. A rupture, a clean break. A tear in the fabric that once held the world together. Carney didn't cloak his message in hopeful euphemisms. He didn't talk about reform or renewal. He said the world had entered a new era and we needed to start acting like it. He exposed what he called the useful fiction. The idea that international law applied equally. That trade rules were fair. That global institutions enforced restraint. Carney told the truth. The strongest powers had always bent the rules when it suited them, and the rest of the world, the so-called middle powers, had played along, hoping for the best. But that era, Carney said, was over. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration, he said. When integration becomes the source of your subordination, the line landed like a thunderclap. And it wasn't just rhetoric. He was describing a shift already underway, where smaller but strategically important nations were beginning to question the costs of connectivity when it meant vulnerability, where globalization, once sold as a win-win, was being re-evaluated through the lens of control. And then Carney did what few expected. He didn't stop at diagnosis. He offered a blueprint. Carney turned to the middle powers. And he told them, it's time to stop waiting for permission. Canada, he said, had already begun moving. Not in protest. Not in defiance. But in preparation. In the 6 months since Carney took office, Canada had doubled its defense spending. not for war, but for sovereignty. It had signed 12 new trade and security agreements spanning 4 continents. Not to isolate, but to diversify. To reduce reliance on any single great power. To build what Carney called strategic autonomy, the ability to say no. He called it a survival strategy for the modern era. A model for others to follow. And then came the signal that none could ignore. Standing before the world, Carney addressed Greenland directly. Canada stands firmly with Greenland and Denmark, he said. And with their right to determine Greenland's future. Free from coercion, he didn't mention the United States. He didn't have to, because everyone in the room knew the context. In the days leading up to Davos, Donald Trump had threatened military action against Greenland. He had demanded that Denmark hand over the territory to the US, suggesting tariffs, sanctions, and the use of force if they refused. Carney's message was clear. Canada would not stand by. More than that, he framed the crisis as a test for NATO itself. If a major alliance member threatened another with force, would the alliance hold? Carney said yes. And he backed it with action. He reaffirmed Canada's unwavering commitment to Article 5 NATO's Collective Defense Clause. He rejected Trump's threatened tariffs outright, and he warned that any attempt to undermine Greenland's sovereignty would be seen as a breach of international norms. But Carney's speech wasn't just about Greenland. It was about a doctrine, a new approach to international cooperation. One that rejects domination in favor of coordination. One that recognizes that middle powers, when aligned, have leverage. That strength can come from unity, not hierarchy. He didn't call for confrontation. He called for preparation. He didn't say, fight. He said build. The response was immediate. The BBC called it a speech for the moment. Rolling Stone described it as clear, courageous, and devastatingly precise. European diplomats called it the most consequential address by a Western leader in years. Because Carney had done something few leaders managed to achieve in a 20-minute speech, he changed the tone of the entire summit. He shifted the conversation from defense to direction, from reacting to leading, from fear to strategy, and he reminded the world that in an age of uncertainty, clarity is power. Then came Wednesday, and Donald Trump walked onto the same stage carrying the weight of a gamble that had gone terribly wrong. His speech began the way many of his speeches do. Light banter, veiled threats, crowd scanning, friends, and a few enemies, he quipped. Nervous laughter flickered, but the tone in the room had changed. Trump had come to Davos with a plan, or at least, a performance. For weeks, he had been escalating the Greenland issue, turning it from a fringe curiosity into a full-blown geopolitical crisis. It started with rhetoric. Greenland was strategically critical, he said. America needed it for national security. Then came the refusal to rule out military force. Then the tariffs not just on Denmark, but on 8 European nations. Then Trump Jr.'s bizarre publicity stunt in Nuuk, where he handed out MAGA hats as if branding was foreign policy. Then the appointment of a special envoy whose sole job was to facilitate the acquisition. The message was unmistakable. The United States was serious about taking Greenland. By diplomacy. Or by force. But something unexpected happened. Europe didn't fracture. It didn't hesitate. It unified. France, Germany, the UK, the Nordic states, even governments normally at odds, came together. They didn't just issue statements. They acted. Denmark, with support from NATO allies, moved troops into Greenland for joint exercises. The deployment wasn't aggressive. It was defensive. But it was decisive. French President Emmanuel Macron stated plainly, "We do not yield to intimidation." Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, said, "Europe will remain united not out of convenience, but principle." The Danish foreign minister was even blunter. Greenland's sovereignty is not negotiable. Ace. Even far-right parties in Europe, typically sympathetic to Trump's worldview, balked. The idea of a NATO member annexing another's territory crossed a line, a fundamental one. And they knew it. Trump had miscalculated. He had assumed, as American presidents once could, that pressure would produce compliance, that economic threats would divide Europe, that the sheer weight of US power would be enough. But the opposite happened. The more he pushed, the more unified his adversaries became, the more erratic his rhetoric, the more measured their response. And when NATO officials began quietly circulating internal memos suggesting that any attack on Greenland would trigger Article 5, meaning collective military response, the stakes crystallized. If the US made good on its threat, it wouldn't be invading an island, it would be declaring war on its own alliance. And Trump? He blinked. At Davos, instead of dominance, he offered something else. A retreat wrapped in rhetoric. He stood before the same audience that had given Carney a standing ovation and announced a framework deal with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Not a treaty, not a commitment, a framework. He described it as a concept for cooperation in the Arctic. It included vague notions of missile defense coordination, mineral development, and joint security protocols. In other words, things that already existed, nothing new, nothing binding, nothing remotely resembling what he had demanded just days before. And yet, he declared victory. He said tariffs would be paused. Military options were now off the table. He emphasized that Greenland would benefit from enhanced cooperation. But when asked directly whether the U.S. would still seek ownership of Greenland, he dodged. It's complex, he told reporters. We're talking. We'll see. It's complex. We'll see. That's not a deal. That's not leadership. That's retreat. But Trump didn't frame it that way. He never does. He called the outcome a win for everyone. A great start. A bold vision. But behind the podium, the picture was clear. He had been forced to back down because Europe had called his bluff, and they hadn't done it with bravado. They'd done it with coordination, with legal clarity, with joint military exercises, with unity, and that, more than any single agreement, was the real headline from Davos. The Greenland crisis had been a test, and Europe passed it. For decades, American power relied on assumptions that allies would comply, that economic might would translate into deference, that threats would work. But in Davos, those assumptions cracked. The image of 8 NATO countries deploying troops together, not for combat, but for symbolic defense, sent a signal. One Trump hadn't expected, and one future leaders will remember. It wasn't just about Greenland. It was about sovereignty, about alliances, about the balance of power in a world no longer defined by a single hegemon. For the first time in decades, European leaders acted not as junior partners to American strategy, but as strategic actors in their own right. They coordinated not just out of loyalty to Denmark, but out of necessity because they saw what was at stake. If a NATO member could use economic threats and military pressure to demand territory from another member, the alliance itself would collapse. The precedent would be fatal, and so they acted not just to defend Greenland, but to defend the concept of NATO itself. And Trump? He overplayed his hand. He assumed that by turning up the pressure, he would win. Instead, he galvanized his opposition. He revealed the limits of coercion, and he reminded the world that even a superpower can be checked not by force, but by unity. Donald Trump came to Davos seeking dominance. He left performing damage control. For weeks, he had pushed the narrative. Greenland wasn't just available. It was necessary. He framed it as a question of national security. He floated the idea of military intervention. He portrayed opposition as irrational, even ungrateful. And at every turn, he escalated. until there was nowhere left to go. So when he stood before the world on January 21st and announced that military is not on the table, it wasn't a clarification, it was a climb down. And make no mistake, that sentence changed everything. For weeks, Trump had refused to take force off the table. Reporters asked. Allies pleaded. Diplomats warned. He didn't budge. Because keeping the military threat alive was his leverage. It was his ace. His bluff. His pressure point. But now? With cameras rolling. With European troops in Greenland. With NATO staring back, he folded. And instead of admitting retreat, he repackaged it. He unveiled what he called a framework deal. Cooperation on Arctic security. Mineral rights coordination. Missile defense alignment. Nothing binding. Nothing enforceable. Just enough language to walk away without admitting what had happened. The United States got no new territory. No concessions. No timeline. No roadmap. Just a verbal agreement that NATO would continue working together. In other words, exactly what NATO was already doing. It was the diplomatic equivalent of repackaging leftovers as a 5-course meal. And yet, Trump declared victory. He spoke of strength, vision, historic outcomes. But behind the podium, the retreat was obvious, even to his allies. Because this wasn't just about policy, it was about power. And what happened in that moment, when Trump ruled out force and reframed his demands, was a public admission that the old tools no longer worked. Coercion had failed. Tariffs had backfired. Military threats had triggered solidarity, not submission. And this wasn't a private negotiation behind closed doors. This was Davos. This was televised, documented, witnessed. The world saw it happen. They saw a leader who built his brand on unpredictability and toughness be cornered by unity and resolve. They saw a superpower recalibrate not because it wanted to, but because it had no good options left. Trump's calculus was clear. He couldn't invade without sparking a full-blown NATO crisis. He couldn't impose tariffs without harming US companies. And he couldn't just walk away without looking weak. So he chose the least damaging option. Declare a non-deal as a deal. Spin a retreat as strategy. But the damage was already done. Because what the world learned that day wasn't just about Greenland. It was about limits. It was about what happens when a bully bluff is met with collective defiance. For years, Trump had relied on disruption as a tactic. Shake the table, then demand new terms. But this time, the table held. The other players didn't leave. They closed ranks. They called his hand. And that matters. Not just for this crisis, but for the next one. Because precedent shapes behavior. And now, the precedent is clear. Unified resistance works. That's the lesson of Davos. That's what will linger long after the framework deal fades from headlines. It wasn't the content of Trump's speech that mattered. It was what he didn't say. No more force. No more acquisition. No more escalation. That silence spoke louder than anything he read from the teleprompter. When history looks back at Davos 2026, it won't be the framework deal that defines the moment. It will be the contrast between two visions of power, two styles of leadership, and two very different futures. Mark Carney stood before the world and declared the old order dead. Not weakened, not in need of reform, finished. And in its place, he offered a strategy not of nostalgia or confrontation, but of cooperation among middle powers. A path to autonomy, a defense against coercion, a call to unify not under one flag, but around shared values. Donald Trump, by contrast, arrived with demands and left with none of them met. He tried to bend NATO to his will. Instead, he revealed its spine. His retreat wasn't just a tactical shift. It was symbolic. It marked a turning point in how the world responds to unilateral threats, not with panic, but with partnership, not with silence, but with solidarity. For decades, the United States operated on a simple assumption: that its economic and military power would guarantee compliance, that allies would fall in line, that dissent would remain private. But Davos showed something else. It showed that in the absence of leadership, coordination fills the gap, that middle powers, when aligned, can resist even the loudest voices. That unity, when purposeful, is more powerful than intimidation. And that truth will echo far beyond Greenland. In Asia, in Latin America, across Africa, nations are watching, and they're recalculating. If Europe can say no and make it stick, so can they. The ripple effect is real. The old playbook threats, tariffs, ultimatums has been exposed. And while its users may continue to deploy it, the world now knows it can be resisted, it can be diffused, it can be defeated. Carney didn't confront Trump. He didn't need to. He showed an alternative. He spoke of rules, of restraint, of building something better. And that vision, quiet, deliberate, principled, may prove to be the most powerful thing said in Davos this year.